Fireside Stories, Season 1, Introduction, a collection of quiet tales, told from places where history lingers and the night listens more closely than the day. These are stories of mysteries left unanswered, of footsteps heard after midnight, and of things that never truly left. Each story begins with a short musical introduction inspired by the country it is set in. Music by AI Studiosphere. Each story is set beside the fire, meant to be heard slowly and remembered long after the embers fade. All stories written by Benjamin Smith, narrated by ElevenLabs.
Paris, 1926. The Dancer of Montmartre. Montmartre looks different after midnight. The crowds thin, the laughter softens, and the city begins to whisper instead of shout. In the winter of 1926, one of those whispers belonged to a dancer from the Moulin Rouge, and then, suddenly, it didn't. She was not famous, not in the way names were printed in newspapers or painted onto posters. But she was known to the stagehands who smoked behind the theater doors, known to the musicians who watched her feet more than their sheet music, known to the regulars who came not for the champagne, but for a final routine just before closing. She danced with restraint, no excess, no grand gestures, just precision, timing, control. They said she smiled only at the very end. On the night she disappeared, Paris was cold, not bitter, just enough to make breath visible beneath the street lamps, the kind of cold that presses people closer together. The final performance ended just after midnight. Applause rose, then fell away. Costumes were gathered, instruments packed. The city exhaled and began to empty. She was seen leaving the Moulin Rouge by a stagehand, who later swore to it. He said she pulled her coat tight and turned uphill toward Montmartre alone. That was the last confirmed sighting. Her room was found untouched the next morning. Bed neatly made, shoes by the door, a single glove resting on the dresser, as if placed there deliberately. No note, no signs of struggle, no missing belongings. Paris police asked questions. Neighbors shrugged. The club replaced her within a week. Paris has always been good at moving on. But Montmartre didn't forget. Within days, rumors took root. A milkman claimed he saw her near the steps of Rue Lepic before dawn, standing beneath a gas lamp that wasn't lit. A violinist said he heard footsteps behind him one night, soft, measured, matching the rhythm of a dancer marking time. And then there were the sightings at the club. Some swore they saw her reflected in the mirrored wall behind the stage during rehearsals. Never directly, only in glass, only for a second. The manager dismissed it all. Nerves, he said, late nights and cheap wine. But something changed after her disappearance. Dancers refused to practice alone. Musicians packed up before the final note had fully faded, and no one used the back corridor anymore, the one that led past the old costume storage. They said the air there felt heavier, as though the room remembered something the people inside it were trying to forget. One winter evening, months later, a new dancer stayed behind after closing. Young, ambitious. She wanted one more rehearsal, one more chance to get it right. The pianist left her with a nod and closed the door. She later said she wasn't afraid at first. The stage lights were low, the mirrors dim, the theater breathing quietly around her. She took her position, and then she heard it. A single footstep, measured, controlled, behind her. She turned. The stage was empty, but in the mirror, just for a moment, she saw a figure standing where she had been moments before. Hands folded, posture perfect, waiting. The girl ran. She never danced again, Years passed. The story faded into cafes and cigarette smoke, another Montmartre tale told late at night, laughed off by those who didn't live there. But even now, locals will tell you this. If you walk the hill after midnight, when the fog rolls in low and the lamps flicker instead of glow, you might hear footsteps behind you, not hurried, not threatening, perfectly timed. And if you pass the Moulin Rouge and glance at the darkened stage door, you may notice a single glove resting just inside, waiting to be claimed.
Prague, 1804. The figure after midnight. Prague has always been a city that watches itself. Its towers lean inward. Its streets curve instead of run straight. And after midnight, even the stones seem to listen. In the winter of 1804, the people of the old town began to lock their doors earlier than usual. Not because of thieves, not because of war, but because something was walking, always after midnight, always alone. The first to speak of it was a baker, whose shop faced a narrow lane near the river. He said he saw a figure standing beneath a gas lamp that had not yet been lit, tall, still, wrapped in a dark coat that moved even when the air did not. At first, he thought it was a drunk. Then the figure stepped forward and passed straight through the locked iron gate at the end of the lane. The baker did not open his shop the next morning. Within days, others began to notice it. A woman returning from a sickbed swore she heard footsteps behind her, slow and deliberate. But when she turned, the street was empty. A night watchman claimed his lantern dimmed as the figure passed him, as if the light itself had drawn back. No one ever saw its face. Only its outline, always the same, always measured, always walking toward the river. By the second week, the streets were empty after midnight. Shutters closed, candles extinguished. Dogs pulled indoors, whining at doors they had once guarded. The town elders dismissed it. Cold, they said. Fog. An overactive imagination fed by candlelight and fear. But then the church bells stopped ringing at night. Not broken, not silenced, simply untouched. The bell ringer, a man who had never missed a night in 30 years, refused to climb the tower after dusk. He said the figure stood at the base of the stairs, waiting. No one ever saw it move quickly. That was the worst part. It did not chase, it did not threaten, it did not call out. It walked, and everything else moved away. One night, a student returning from a tavern ignored the warnings. Wine made him brave. Laughter made him careless. He took the long way home. Witnesses later said they heard a single shout echo across the stone streets, not a cry of pain, a cry of recognition. They found him at dawn near the river steps, alive, unmarked, but changed. He would not speak, would not sleep, would not cross bridges. When asked what he saw, he wrote only one sentence, over and over again. It walks because it is not finished. By spring, the sightings faded. The figure no longer appeared beneath the lamps. The footsteps stopped. Prague breathed again. But even now, the old stories remain. Locals will tell you that some nights, when the fog settles low and the river moves too quietly, the streets near the water empty on their own. No signal, no warning, just instinct. And if you are ever in Prague after midnight, and you hear footsteps behind you that never hurry and never slow, do not turn around, because some things are not meant to be seen twice.
Edinburgh, 1828, the Unquiet Dead. Edinburgh has never been afraid of the dead. Its streets are built on them, layer by layer, stone upon stone. But in the winter of 1828, the city began to fear something else. Not death itself, but disturbance. The graves came first. Shallow, fresh, opened quietly beneath the cover of darkness. Families arrived at kirkyards in the morning to find soil turned and coffins disturbed, sometimes empty, sometimes not quite. No valuables were taken, no damage done beyond the opening itself, just absence. 2 doctors were blamed, though never openly. Men of learning, men of progress. They said the body was only flesh once the soul had gone. That knowledge demanded sacrifice. Edinburgh listened and said nothing. But the dead did not agree. The first sounds were reported in Greyfriars just after midnight. A groundskeeper swore he heard movement beneath the earth. Not scratching, not digging, shifting. As though something below was trying to remember where it belonged. Then came the dreams. People living near the kirkyards began waking at the same hour every night. Their rooms cold, their breath visible. They dreamed of narrow spaces, of light stolen away, of hands pressing against wood that would not answer. One woman said she woke with soil beneath her fingernails. She had not left her bed. By spring, sightings spread through the old town, figures standing near grave walls, silent, unmoving. They did not wander the streets. They did not approach the living. They lingered, as if waiting for permission to lie down again. A watchman near the South Bridge vaults claimed he saw several figures gathered together just before dawn, not facing the city, facing the ground, heads bowed. When he approached, his lantern dimmed and the figures faded, not vanished, faded, as if sinking back into the stone itself. The doctors continued their work. Knowledge advanced, lecture halls filled. But something followed them home. Servants quit without explanation. Horses refused to enter certain courtyards. Candles went out in rooms where no windows were open. One assistant later said he heard whispers at night. Not accusations, requests. Put us back. The disturbances ended suddenly. No announcement was made. No apologies offered. But the graves were closed again. Heavily. Carefully. Iron cages were installed above the dead, not to keep them in, but to keep them whole. Edinburgh settled, yet even now the city remembers. Locals will tell you that if you walk past an old kirkyard after midnight, you may feel the ground beneath your feet grow heavy, as if bearing more than it should. And if the wind shifts just right, you might hear something that sounds like a breath being released, not in fear, but in relief. Because some souls are not restless from anger, only from being moved before they were ready to rest.
Japan, 1783. The place that should not be walked. In old Japan, there were places people avoided, not because they were dangerous, but because they were finished. Paths once used, homes once lived in, ground that had already remembered enough. In the winter of 1783, one such place lay beyond a small mountain village where the forest thickened and the air grew still even when the wind moved elsewhere. No birds nested there, no insects sang, and no one walked it after dark. The village elders said the land had become tired. They did not explain further. When asked, they simply bowed their heads and said the same thing every time. Some places listen. The first man to ignore the warnings was a charcoal burner returning late from the hills. He knew the forest well, had walked it since childhood, but that night the path felt longer. The lantern light did not reach as far as it should have, and the trees stood closer together than he remembered. Halfway through the forest, he heard footsteps behind him. Not hurried, not heavy, bare feet on packed earth. He stopped. The footsteps stopped. When he turned, the path behind him was empty, but the lantern flame bent inward, as if leaning toward something unseen. He reached the village before dawn. He never spoke again. Within weeks, others began to notice changes. A woman drawing water before sunrise swore she saw a figure standing at the edge of the forest. Not fully formed, like a shape remembered rather than seen. A child said he heard his name, whispered from between the trees, spoken in his mother's voice, though she stood beside him at the time. No one followed the sounds. Everyone knew better. The elders met in silence and placed new markers along the forest edge. Simple wooden posts, no writing, no symbols, just a boundary. But boundaries only matter when both sides respect them. One night, after heavy snowfall, a young monk from a nearby temple failed to return from his evening walk. They found his sandals neatly placed at the forest entrance, facing inward. The villagers burned incense for 7 nights. On the 8th, the footsteps returned. Not on the path, but inside the village itself. Soft, measured, always stopping just outside doorways. No one opened their doors, no one looked outside. At dawn, faint marks were found in the snow. Impressions too light to belong to a living body, leading back toward the forest. After that, the elders closed the path completely. Offerings were placed at the boundary. Rice, water, quiet prayers. The forest accepted them. The footsteps faded, but the village never forgot. Even now, in parts of Japan, where the forest grows thick and old paths disappear beneath moss, people will tell you this. If you hear footsteps behind you where no one should be walking, do not answer, do not turn, because some spirits are not angry. They are only lost, and the most dangerous thing you can do is help them remember where they were never meant to return.
New Orleans, 1891. When the drums stop, New Orleans does not sleep the way other cities do. It rests, it listens, and it remembers. In the summer of 1891, the heat lingered long after sunset, pressing down on the French Quarter like a held breath. Candles burned low, shutters stayed open, and music drifted through the streets, even when no musicians could be seen. They said it was a good year for spirits. The drums began near the river, slow at first, measured, deep enough to be felt through the soles of the feet rather than heard. Those who knew better closed their doors. Those who didn't followed the sound. It led them down narrow streets where lantern light thinned and shadows stretched longer than they should have. At the end of one such street stood a courtyard that did not appear on any map. No sign marked it, no gate closed it off. But everyone knew where it was. They called it a working place. That night, a young man entered the courtyard alone. He had come looking for answers, for luck, for forgiveness, for something to loosen the weight that had settled behind his eyes. Witnesses later said, the drums stopped the moment he crossed the threshold. The silence that followed felt heavier than the sound ever had. No one saw what happened inside, but at dawn the man was found seated on the steps of St. Louis Cathedral, alive, unharmed, smiling. He spoke kindly to those who passed him, greeted strangers by name, knew things he should not have known. By nightfall, the smile had faded. Within days, others began to notice changes across the quarter. Candles burned without flickering, shadows moved against the direction of the light, and music sometimes continued after the musicians had packed away their instruments. People spoke in whispers of old rites, of promises made in desperation, of debts that could not be repaid in coin. The drums returned the following week, this time closer, this time inside the city. They played just before midnight, always stopping at the same hour, as if listening for a reply. Those who heard them dreamed of water, dark water, slow water, the Mississippi moving without sound. A priest said the city felt open. A root worker said something had been left unfinished. The courtyard vanished shortly after. Bricked over, built upon, no one remembered who owned the land. But even now, New Orleans holds the rhythm. Locals will tell you that some nights, when the air is thick and the streets are slick with rain, you might hear drums beneath the music. Not loud, not calling, waiting. And if the sound ever stops suddenly, do not follow the silence, because in New Orleans nothing is taken without something being left behind.
Mexico, 1910, when the dead return home. In Mexico, the dead are not gone. They are remembered, spoken to, invited back. On the night of the Day of the Dead, candles are lit not to guide spirits away, but to help them find their way home. In the autumn of 1910, a small village prepared as it always had. Altars were built with care, photographs placed gently, bread set out while still warm. Marigold petals traced paths from doorways to graves bright enough to be seen even in the dark. The living did not fear the night. They welcomed it. But that year, something followed the candles that was not expected. It began at the cemetery, just after dusk. An old caretaker noticed footprints between the graves, shallow impressions, as if someone had walked without pressing fully into the earth. He followed them to an altar that did not belong to anyone. No photograph, no name. Only candles burning low and a bowl of water untouched. He left it alone. Some things he knew were not meant to be questioned. By midnight, people began to hear movement in their homes. Not loud, not threatening. The sound of chairs being pulled out, of doors opening carefully, the way one does when trying not to wake others. A woman said she smelled her father's tobacco drifting through the house. A child swore he felt a hand rest briefly on his shoulder while he slept. No one panicked, This was the night the dead were allowed to return, but near the edge of the village, a small house stood dark. No altar burned there, no candles marked the way. The family inside had refused to take part. Old superstitions, they said, better left behind. That night, their door opened on its own. Neighbors later said they saw candlelight flicker briefly inside the house, though no candles had been lit. By morning, the family was gone. No signs of struggle, no packed belongings, only marigold petals scattered across the floor leading inward. The villagers rebuilt the altar at the cemetery the following year. This time, they added a photograph. No one spoke of the house again. Even now, in parts of Mexico where traditions are kept carefully and the dead are spoken to with kindness, people will tell you this. On the Day of the Dead, the veil grows thin. Those who are remembered find their way home, and those who are not will still follow the candles, because being forgotten is far more dangerous than being dead.
Istanbul, 1872. The city that echoes. Istanbul has always stood between things, between continents, between faiths, between what was and what never quite left. In 1872, the city moved by rhythm rather than time. Calls to prayer crossed the Bosphorus before sunrise. Footsteps echoed through stone courtyards long after the crowds had gone. And some streets were avoided not because they were dangerous, but because they listened too closely. There was one alley near the old walls that people crossed quickly, not running, never running, just not lingering. It was narrow and curved so that you could never see its far end from the entrance. Lanterns there burned dimmer than elsewhere, though no one could say why. At night, the sound of footsteps behaved strangely. They did not belong to the walker. A man passing through would hear his steps return to him half a breath later, not louder, not softer, perfectly matched, as if someone else were walking with him. The first prayer keeper to speak of it did so reluctantly. He said that during the final call of the evening, his voice echoed back from the alley, not distorted, not delayed, answered in the same tone, at the same pitch, as though the words had been accepted and repeated. Soon, others noticed the same thing. Whispers that came back intact, names spoken softly, returned with care. No one heard anything new, only what they themselves had offered, until one night the echo answered without being called. A merchant closing his shop heard his own name spoken behind him, gently, correctly. When he turned, the alley stood empty, but the sound of breathing remained, not close, not far, balanced. The imam declared the alley a crossing, a place where sound and intention lingered longer than they should. He warned the people not to speak there after sunset, not prayers, not names, especially not regrets. But the city is full of those who carry unfinished words. One evening, a grieving mother entered the alley alone. Witnesses later said she stood still and spoke quietly into the stone, not loudly, not angrily. She asked only one question. "Why did you leave before I could finish loving you?" Those nearby said the alley went completely silent. No echo, no answer. The woman was found at dawn, seated peacefully against the wall, her face calm, her eyes closed, as if listening. After that, the alley was sealed, bricked over, absorbed into the city like so many things before it. But Istanbul does not forget its crossings. Even now, locals will tell you that on certain nights, when the air is still and the Bosphorus carries sound without distortion, you may hear footsteps that perfectly match your own. And if you ever hear your words returned to you exactly as you spoke them, do not answer, because some places do not judge. They only remember. And memory in a city like Istanbul never truly fades.
Transylvania, 1893, what still lives here. In Transylvania, no one laughs at old stories. They listen politely. Then they change the subject, because the land remembers too much to be mocked. In the autumn of 1893, a small village near the Carpathian Mountains prepared for winter earlier than usual. Windows were shuttered before dusk, livestock brought in close, and doors were marked with symbols so old no one remembered their meaning. They were not for protection. They were reminders. A foreigner arrived just before the first snow. A scholar, polite, well-spoken. He asked about castles, about noble families who no longer appeared in records, about villages that had vanished between census years. The locals answered carefully. Some things, they said, did not die. They thinned. At night, the forests pressed in close. The trees stood so still, they seemed to lean toward the houses, listening for breath. The scholar stayed in a guest room above the church. On his first night, he dreamed of footsteps climbing stairs that never reached the landing. On his second, he dreamed of voices speaking his name, not loudly, not urgently, as if confirming it. By the third night, the dreams stopped. Instead, he woke, every night, at the same hour, just before dawn, with the certainty that something had been standing beside the bed moments before he opened his eyes. He began to notice things during the day. Animals avoided certain paths. Shadows gathered where walls met, even at noon, and the villagers never entered the forest without a companion. When asked why, an old woman answered simply, "Some things still count." The scholar eventually found what he had been searching for: ruins on a high ridge, stones blackened by age and weather, a place abandoned not by war or fire, but by agreement. No birds nested there, no moss grew on the inner walls. Inside he felt watched, not threatened, measured, as if the space itself were deciding whether he belonged there. He returned to the village, shaken. That night the bells rang without being touched. Once, then again. The villagers lit candles but did not pray. They listened. At dawn, the scholar was gone. No struggle, no blood, no trace. Only his journal remained on the desk. The final entry was written in a steady hand. "It is not a man that endures here. It is hunger, and hunger does not die." The villagers sealed the room. The bells never rang on their own again. But even now, locals will tell you this. If you walk through Transylvania at night and feel watched, do not search the trees. Do not scan the ruins. Look instead at the spaces where nothing stands, because what lives here no longer needs a body. And legends are not warnings of monsters. They are records of what survived us.
York 1012, the ship that did not leave. York has always been a city built by arrivals, Romans, Saxons, Vikings, each leaving something behind: stone, names, stories. In the winter of 1012, the river Ouse lay quiet beneath a pale sky when a ship appeared at dawn. A longship, dark wood, carved prow, weathered sails. It came without urgency. No oars cutting the water, no call from the deck. It simply drifted in with the tide. The townsfolk gathered along the riverbank, cautious but curious. The ship was old, older than it should have been to still float. No crew stood aboard, no banners marked allegiance, but its hold was full. Food, furs, bronze tools, shiny objects wrapped carefully in cloth, trade goods, an offering perhaps. The reeve ordered the ship secured for the night. Guards were posted, torches lit, York slept. By morning things were missing. Not everything. Just enough to be noticed. A basket of dried fish gone. A bundle of silver rings missing. A single axe taken cleanly from where it had rested. The guards swore no one had passed them. The river had not risen. The ropes had not been cut. The ship remained exactly where it had been left. The second night more went missing. Again, not violently, no disturbance, no broken seals. Only absence. By the third night people spoke of old stories, of ships that returned not to raid but to reclaim, of crews lost to storms who never learned they were gone. An old fisherman said the ship had come back because it had been promised a welcome and never given one. On the fourth night the guards refused to stay. Torches guttered out on their own. The air along the river grew heavy, thick with the smell of wet wood and iron. At dawn the hold was nearly empty, food taken, metal gone, but one thing remained. A small carved figure, worn smooth by handling, a man with no eyes. The townsfolk did not argue. They pushed the ship back into the river. No ropes, no sails. They let the tide decide. The longship drifted away without resistance, turning slowly until the river took it out of sight. Nothing else went missing after that. But even now, in York, when the fog settles thick along the Ouse and the city quiets earlier than it should, some will tell you this. If you hear the sound of water moving without wind, or notice small things missing by morning, do not assume theft, because some visitors are not looking for new riches. They are only collecting what was always theirs.